Beef grading and evaluation is probably one of the most difficult things to learn and master as a meats judger. So I'm actually going to break beef evaluation into 3 separate segments: beef quality grading, beef yield grading, and also general rules for judging beef carcasses and beef cuts. Beef carcass evaluation. The objectives of this tutorial to learn the USDA quality grading standards and how they relate to meats judging. We'll also learn the USDA yield grading standards, and most importantly, we're going to learn the yield grading calculation shortcut. So there's many different methods on calculating the USDA yield grade, and I'm going to teach you 2 alternative methods to the official USDA yield grade that still gives you the same answer. We're also going to break it out into general beef judging rules, so beef carcasses as well as beef cuts. So USDA beef quality grading. Beef quality grading consists of marbling, so the intramuscular fat that we see in the lean. We see all this beautiful marbling here within the ribeye, but marbling isn't the only factor that makes up the beef quality grade. They also consist of maturity. So that is bone maturity, so how old the animal is physiologically. We're going to be looking at the age of their bones and also of the color of their lean. So as animals age, their bones get harder and become more ossified. And also as animals age, their meat gets darker. So quality grading is ultimately how good the meat is going to taste. It's the visual measurement that helps determine the eating experience and palatability of the beef. These factors for quality grading include carcass maturity. Carcass maturity is the #1 grading factor because how much detrimental effects age has to do on meat tenderness and texture. The older the animals get, the tougher the meat gets. So that's why we prefer to harvest animals at a younger age. The firmness, texture, and color of lean. The finer, firmer textured lean is going to be more palatable and a more desirable eating experience than a coarser, softer texture lean. Also, the amount and distribution of marbling. So it's not necessarily just how many flecks of marbling, but the size of the marbling and then how consistent that marbling is throughout that ribeye within that lean. So, but the most important factors, first thing that we're going to evaluate for beef quality grading is going to be the marbling and then also the maturity of those carcasses. So marbling is the intramuscular fat deposited within the muscle lean. So this is intramuscular. This is all the fat within the lean. This is all this delicious marbling that's within that lean. It's always going to be evaluated on beef carcasses at the cut surface between the 12th and 13th rib. That's why you see all these carcasses that are here behind me. Every single carcass is going to be evaluated and ribbed between the 12th and 13th rib. And ribbing just means we're going to cut into that ribeye to expose that ribeye muscle so we can evaluate not only quality grade, but also yield grade. The greater amount of marbling increases palatability. It's the tenderness, the juiciness, and flavor that we expect to get from a beef carcass. The greater amount of marbling that the meat has, the more tender, juicy, and flavorful that cut of meat is going to be while we are eating it. So there are different marbling scores. So here's a marbling score we see slightly abundant. That is a description of how much marbling is within that lean. So we can see that there is an abundant amount of marbling. It's slightly abundant. So that's going to be a really high quality grade. It's going to be an excellent eating experience. Here, a description is our small amount. So there's a small amount of marbling within that ribeye. And here we can see there's a slight amount. We can kind of see some flecks in there. It's a little bit less than we would like. And then down here, there's only traces. I maybe see 2 or 3 flecks of marbling. And that amount of marbling is not going to have any added beneficial effects to our eating experience. So within our marbling scores are a descriptive term that gives us kind of a visual measurement of how much marbling is within that ribeye. We're going to talk about from the greatest amount of marbling down to the least amount of marbling. Prime marbling. So if we have an animal that is a maturity, it's a young animal, it's under 30 months of age, we are going to consider these marbling scores within these specific quality grades. Prime carcasses only make about 9% of all carcasses that are graded. There's only 9% that are prime. That's why prime is so valuable, it's so sought after, and it's very high value because the market just isn't there. There just aren't enough cattle that grade prime. So I break these grades, these marbling scores, the terminology into the grade, the marbling score, and then also the abbreviation. So if we were to have a maturity animal and it had abundant amount of marbling, then its quality grade would be high prime. And our abbreviation for that marbling score would be abundant. So AB is abundant. And then within each one of these marbling scores, so this is one specific score, there's a grade of 0 to 100 degrees of marbling within that score. So then we have average prime. And average prime, our score, we call that moderately abundant. So here we can see this is the first picture of moderately abundant. We don't have a picture of abundant. That is a lot of marbling. That is a really, really high. It's so high, it's not even on our scale. But the majority of cattle that we see that do grade the prime grade are not even going to be abundant or moderately abundant. They are going to be exceptional. There's very, very few cattle that actually grade abundant or moderately abundant. But our moderately abundant, that's prime average. So this little 0 here at the top, we use that as our average designation. Moderately abundant, and our abbreviation will be MAB, MAB for moderately abundant. Then we have low prime. So the majority of all cattle that do grade prime are usually going to fall in this marbling score, in this quality grade. So we call that low prime or slightly abundant. So we can see here in this ribeye, this is what slightly abundant amount of marbling looks like. It's low prime, and its abbreviation is SLAB. We call that SLAB. So we have AB, MAB, and SLAB make up the 3 separate marbling scores within the prime grade. We have high, average, low, abundant, moderately abundant, slightly abundant, AB, MAB, and SLAB. Next quality grade that we're going to look at is choice. And 74% of all cattle graded are going to grade choice in today's market. So within those grades, we have high choice. So high choice, we give that marbling score, we call that moderate. And so we give that abbreviation as MD for moderate. So MD for moderate. So we can see here down at this very first ribeye, this ribeye has a moderate amount of marbling. So it's a slightly less amount of marbling than our prime grade, but it's still a moderate amount. So we call that our high choice. The next grade is our average choice. Our average choice, we call that modest. And I actually call that modest. I know that's not how it is actually spelled, but I pronounce it modest so that you remember that the abbreviation for modest is MT. So MT is going to be average choice, whereas MD is going to be high choice. So you can see we have a modest amount of marbling, slightly less than our high choice. These 2 choice grades are both considered top choice. So these 2 grades of carcasses qualify for what we call the top choice boxed beef program. So they consider this the upper 2/3 of choice. They are actually sold together. They're sold in the same box as if they were the same grade. So even though in meats judging, we designate high choice and average choice, in industry, both of these grades are going to be considered top choice or the upper 2/3 choice. So when we are going to be looking at a official note card and you see top choice box beef program, that means that those carcasses were either moderate or modest in their marbling. So the last choice grade is going to be low choice. So the majority of cattle, of the 74%, are going to grade in this low choice category. There's a huge designation between our high choice and average choice in comparison to our low choice. Low choice is sold at a lower value. We call low choice our small amount of marbling, and our abbreviation is SM. So we have our top choice, which is our high choice, and our average choice, and then low choice, which is our small grade. The next grade we have is our select grade. So select grade is a much lower corner of the market. It's about 17% of the cattle currently that is graded at the packing houses. There used to be many more cattle that graded select, but through feeding longer, we are actually improving quality grade, and the demand for select isn't as high as it is for choice. The select has to be a little bit different. So in our prime, we have 3 grades. We have abundant, moderately abundant, and slightly abundant. In choice, we have high choice, average choice, low choice, and then select, they break it into 2 separate grades. So there's no select average. They just have to be different by saying that there's no select average. In the select grade, designate their scores slightly different. So when I was talking about that there are 100 degrees within each one of those specific marbling scores, this slight grade or the select grade actually splits those 100 degrees in half. So our high select grade will be considered slight 50 up to 90, and we call that, our abbreviation is still slight. So anything slight 50 through 90 is considered the quality grade high select. Low select is slight 0 through 40, and its abbreviation is still slight, but it's considered low select. So you can see here, this ribeye probably, I know the picture doesn't look that great, but it's probably about slight 40 or slight 50. I was hoping it'd be slight 50 so you can have an example of what high select looks like versus this is our marbling card. You can only see there's slight amounts, little kind of nicks of marbling, and that would be our slight 0. So this is going to be designated broken in between our degrees of 0 through 100. So the last marbling score that we see is what we call standard. And currently in industry, there are less than 1% of cattle that grade standard. We are able to feed cattle enough. We have genetically selected cattle enough to select for carcasses that actually grade and have some marbling in there. But if there are still the standard grade that is going to be in the cooler, it's just less than 1%. So high standard, we call that traces. So traces, there's going to be some little nicks, some tiny trace amount of marbling in there. Then we have low standard or average. There's actually 3 degrees, but anything below high standard we call just low standard, and that's practically devoid. And you can see here looking at this ribeye that besides like 2 or 3 flecks, it's practically devoid of marbling. There is 0 marbling present in there, and so we call that our low standard or our practically devoid. Quality grade versus marbling score. There's a huge difference in meats judging when we are going to talk about quality grade versus marbling scores. Quality grade is going to be our prime, choice, select, standard. They're going to be our high, our average, and our low. So each one of those designations within that quality grade is going to be what we're going to call it. So there's high prime, average prime, low prime, high choice, average choice, low choice, high select, low select, high standard, and low standard. But within each one of these thirds, or in select and standard cases in halves, but within each one of these thirds, we're going to break them into specific marbling scores. So we have marbling scores of 0 through 100 within each one of those marbling scores. So again, marbling score is going to be moderate, modest, small, slight, So those marbling scores, each one of those grades is going to be graded 0 through 100. And you do that by giving a designation such as this. So this is our abbreviation, MATIST. Remember with the T, MATIST is going to be average choice. So MATIST 60 is our marbling score. If that cattle was A maturity, then MATIST 60 would be considered average choice. Then we have our marbling score small 80. If that carcass is A maturity, then that small 80s quality grade would end up being low choice. Then we have slight 20, that should be slight 20. Within our quality grade, if that carcass is going to be A maturity, then slight 20 is going to be graded low select. So marbling score plus maturity equals overall quality grade. Here are our marbling cards. You guys have probably used these and practiced on them quite a bit. So only if these marbling scores, if that carcass's maturity is A maturity, so it's a youthful carcass, then these marbling scores equal that quality grade. Here I have moderately abundant, that would be average prime. Slightly abundant, low prime. Moderate would be high choice. MATIST would be average choice. Small, low choice. And then slight would be select. So that would be our quality grades for our specific marbling scores if those carcasses were A maturity. There are also instances where we do see dark cutter, so dark cutting beef. Depending on the severity of those dark cutting characteristics, the prime, choice, or select grade may be reduced as much as 1 full grade. This dark cutter, we can see here in this ribeye, is this darkish purplish colored lean. And just depending on how dark that color ribeye, we can actually reduce that quality grade that we came up with depending on its marbling score, and it can be reduced by 1 full grade. So if we were to grade this carcass as low choice, because of its dark cutter, it would be reduced to high select. If this carcass marbling score told us that it was high choice, it would be reduced 1 full grade to choice average. This condition is due to long-term stress of the animal. So if that animal has been stressed for a really long time prior to slaughter, either through transport or potentially it's a show steer. Lots of show steers have beef stress syndrome, that if they are a long-term stressy animal, then this will show up in cattle, but it's still very low and the incidence of this is not that high. If a carcass does have dark cutting beef, then you have a huge discount, about $37.40 per hundredweight on the price of cattle at that time. So huge discount for this defect. Maturity. So we talked a lot about marbling scores and marbling scores that they have to match up with their specific maturity. So maturity of the animal is very important as far as the tenderness and flavor. So maturity of a carcass actually determines the physiological age of the animal. As a deer comes into the slaughterhouse, they do not have their birth certificate. They aren't telling you, hey, this is my birthday, this is exactly how old I am. So because of that, we actually evaluate carcasses on their physiological age rather than their chronological age. So every single animal is going to age differently, and some are going to be faster maturing than others. And so we're actually going to be looking at the physiological components that are going to display age. Within our maturity evaluation, first thing we're going to look at is the ossification of cartilage. So ossification of cartilage on the surface of all of our bones, there are cartilage knobs. And as we age and as cattle grow older, that cartilage eventually turns into bone and it starts to get very brittle and hard, and it's no longer soft cartilage. So also the bones will become whiter, wider, and flatter. So as younger animals are really red, they're soft, they're porous, very youthful looking. The bones are very soft and very strong. And as that animal ages, the bones become wider, whiter, and also flatter, whereas their cartilage will turn into bone. So I like to use this as a perfect example, which I would never ever do this, but the perfect example of maturity is if I was to take a young baby. A baby has lots of cartilage. It's very malleable. It's very, very soft. I take this baby, I just kind of drop it on the ground a little bit. The baby will bounce and probably cry, be upset, but it won't really break a bone. It will be okay. However, if I take my 85-year-old grandmother and I was to push her on the ground, which I wouldn't, but if I was to push her on the ground, she would probably break a hip, break an arm, break a leg, break something, because all of her cartilage that she once had has turned now into bone, and her bones have become very, very brittle. And so this has an effect not only on the bone structure, but if the bones are getting harder and stronger, then so are those muscle fibers. They're getting tougher, and they're making those meat products more tough and chewier and undesirable in their palatability. Another maturity factor we're going to look at is the color and the texture of lean. So as animal ages, their lean becomes darker because their muscles actually shrink, so they concentrate all of that color, and then their texture becomes a lot coarser because they are, not only is their bones ossifying, but the fibers within the muscle are ossifying and kind of binding as well. So that's why our meat is going to be very tough. So cartilage turns into bone, our lean color darkens, and the texture becomes coarser with increasing age. Older meat equals tougher meat. It's just not as desirable depending on how you cook that meat. So most of the older animals that do get sent to slaughter are actually going to be turned into a ground meat product, whereas the younger animals are going to fill our retail case and supply us with steaks, chops, and roasts. When we're evaluating beef carcasses for skeletal maturity, again, we are looking at the physiological age of that carcass. So the first thing you're going to do as a meat judger when you're walking up to a beef carcass while you're quality grading, so you want to look right here, here's your ribeye, and you want to evaluate the cartilage on the rib. So we're actually going to be looking specifically at what we call these cartilaginous buttons. So at the end of these spinous processes, so if you actually feel down your backbone and you feel the knobs, the little bumps in your backbone, you're actually not feeling bone, you are feeling these cartilaginous buttons. And so we are looking in those buttons and we are determining physiological age by how much ossification we see within each one of those buttons. So we're also going to be looking at the ribs. So the ribs are going to be on the inside of the carcass. We want redder, rounder, or youthful ribs. And then we'll also look at those spinous processes. So the spinous processes, this is in the thoracic vertebrae. We call this the feather headdress. So that feather headdress, if you look at this, kind of looks like a bunch of feathers. We actually call this in industry, we call them the feather bones because they look like a bunch of feathers. So at the very end of these feather bones, at the end of the spinous processes, we have these cartilaginous buttons. So we are actually going to evaluate skeletal maturity and grade them in specific letter grades. So we have grade A, B, C, D, and E. So each one of these letter grades is actually going to designate the age and maturity of those carcasses. So an A maturity carcass, that's the majority of the cattle that we are seeing in industry. The majority of carcasses are going to be a young carcass. They're from animals that were anywhere from 9 to 30 months of age. We have a little bit advancing maturity. We have a fairly young carcass that's considered a younger carcass, and that's anywhere 30 to 42 months of age. And research has shown that A and B maturity is still very similar as far as tenderness goes, but once we get to C maturity, those are going to be significantly different as far as tenderness in that meat from those animals. So C maturity is considered the youngest of the old carcasses. So those cattle were 3.5 to 6 years of age upon slaughter. D carcasses, they're a fairly old carcass or very old cow. They're about 6 to 8 years of age. And then E is very old. It's an extremely old carcass. You won't see any more ossification. They are similar to our 85-year-old grandmother, and they are greater than 8 years of age when they go into slaughter. Within FFA meats judging, there is an important note that we have to consider. So carcass maturity used in FFA quality grading classes will be selected only from A, B, and C grades, excluding B70 through C49. So if there is a maturity grade and it happens to lie in between B70 and C50 as someone putting on a contest, we do not allow that carcass in the contest. It does not qualify. We want to make it easy enough for you guys to understand it's definitely A bone, it's definitely B bone, and anything C50 and above is going to be definitely C bone. So it's a really tricky in between the B and C kind of window because there's a huge difference between A and B carcasses and C, D, and E carcasses. So as someone putting on a contest, just know that we are not allowed to present carcasses that are either B70 all the way up to C49, going on to C50. So if there are D and E maturity ranges, those are still going to be allowed. And then also no cutter or canner carcasses will be exhibited. So that's a good tidbit to know when you're evaluating quality grading of carcasses, that it's either going to be A, B, as in B through B70, and then C is going to be definitely C, so it has to be C50 or higher to be allowed in the contest. So A maturity. So what are we looking at? So we know we're going to be looking at the cartilaginous button. So we are going to be looking at the top 3 cartilaginous buttons. So there's lots of different buttons in here, but we are looking at the best 3 that give us the best evaluation. So we can see there's kind of a button right here, but that's kind of cut in half. It's really small. It's not a good one to evaluate. So then we go to the next 3. So the top 3 best thoracic buttons is where we're going to make our evaluation of where ossification is going to be in those cartilaginous buttons. This chart here is a guide used for interpreting the degree of maturity. So at A maturity, you'll see there is 0% ossification. So here we see there's 0%. One thing that's hard as a meat judger is looking at what ossification actually is. So we'll be looking here, there's little flecks of fat, there's little blood vessels in there, but that is not considered ossification. That is just extra particles. Ossification is when that cartilage is starting to turn into bone. It will look dark, it will be very hard, and it will also be porous. So it will look very similar to that internal structure of that feather bone. So if it's starting to look like it's growing feather bone out here in the tip, then that is what we consider ossification. So A maturity, again, just like in our beef marbling scores, we have a score from 0 to 100. We have a score from 0 to 100 in between these grades as well. So A 0 through A 90 is going to be A maturity. and then B0 to B90, C0 to C90, D0 to D90, and then E0 all the way up to E100. The reason why I say to A0 to A90, because A100 equals B0. So as a beef evaluator, we're going to go, instead of calling it A100, we call it B0. Within the A maturity, we have 0 to 10% ossification. So you can have a tiny bit of ossification out here on the end for A maturity, but it has to be less than 10% of the whole. B maturity, we have 10 to 35% ossification. So the average of these three buttons has to be between 10 and 35. C maturity is 35 through 70. D maturity is 70 through 90, and then E maturity it's 90 or greater percent ossified. There's no more cartilage left in those buttons. So let's look at some examples. So here we have A maturity. Primarily as a meats judger, we're mostly concerned with looking at the thoracic vertebrae. We're looking at the buttons that are on the rib, on the thorax of the animal. So we want to evaluate these top three thoracic buttons, and we can see there's 0 ossification. They look beautiful, they look white. So then we roll on. We don't have to calculate maturity. So whatever marbling score that you call that ribeye is going to equal that quality grade. Here is B20. We are actually going to look, we can see these thoracic buttons up here. There's a little bit of ossification, so it kind of looks like a little hat that's sitting up here at the top. This next button, we can see this dark red, and it's probably pretty hard material that's growing at the end of this thoracic button. So here we can see that's about 25% ossified. This one is about 10% ossified. But then this one down here is going to be 0% ossified. So you take the average of the three, and so that gives us, they figured it out to be B20. So if you see a carcass that has a little bit of ossification out here at the end, and it's greater than 10% total, then that would be considered B maturity. So again, anything greater than B70 all the way up to C49 is not going to be in your contest. So you don't have to worry about that. Okay, so here we have a B80. This one's about 40% ossified. This one's about 2015. So they calculated this out to be B80. So if this carcass, if there's this amount of ossification within these thoracic buttons, you know that B80 does not fit in our category. It is too high to be in an FFA meats judging contest. So go ahead and disregard, because it shouldn't be there. So don't be calling it if it is there. It should be less than that. Okay, so here is C20. So here in this thoracic button, that looks like it's about 60, 75%. This one is about 30%, and this one's about 15%. I'm just kind of making up averages here. And an average, they calculated out to be about C20. So this still isn't enough ossification for you guys to be calling C grade. So it needs to have more ossification than this, because if we look at this carcass and our B80 carcass, they're pretty similar, they're very close, and so we're going to disregard those two. Okay, this is C90. There is significant amount of ossification present. There is probably anywhere from 60 to 70% of ossification in these three. So that's why they go ahead and call it B90. So if there's this amount of ossification, you can go ahead and call it. It's going to be within that C grade. Okay, so next we have D90. There's still a little bit of ossification. Our D percentage is going to be 70% to 90%. So if they're in between 70% and 90% ossified, they're going to be considered D maturity. Then I don't have a picture of E-maturity because E-maturity is pretty much the entire cartilage button is going to be ossified. So there is a kind of method on how you take your percentages. I just kind of look at all three and kind of get a visual, but if you want to calculate each specific button to ensure your actual carcass maturity, you can do that as well. So we're always going to look at our top 3 thoracic buttons. So here is our top 3. They're the best 3 that give us the most uniform evaluation. So this first button, there's about 30% ossification. Our second button is about 35% ossification. Fourth button is about 40% ossification. Then you're going to add those percentages together, and then you're going to find the average. So finding the average, you just divide them by 3, and that equals 35%. So remember, at 35%, that would be C0 maturity. So you guys don't have to worry about for C maturity, but that's just an example on how you calculate your 3 buttons to get your average percentage of ossification. Then you have to memorize that chart and know where the percentage lie as far as A, B, C, D, and E maturity. As a carcass evaluator, as a quality grader, we learned about marbling scores, we learned about maturity scores. So we are going to combine marbling and maturity to come up with our overall quality grade. So probably many of you have seen this chart. This chart is what we use to determine our quality grade. So I've kind of altered this chart a little bit to kind of help understand what each one of these sections mean. So within our degrees of marbling, we talked about within each degree, there's 0 to 100. So on this chart, we are going 0 to 100, 0 to 100, 0 to 100, and so on and so forth, all the way through each one of those degrees of marbling. Well, we also have the same grades within our maturity, and we have 0 through 100, 0 through 100, and so on and so forth. So for example, if we have a small 30, so we find small, then we go on our scale, we go small 30, but then we have A60, kind of A60 would be, our grade would be low choice. If you had a modest 30 and you found that you were B70 in your maturity score, so you have modest 30, and you go over, and then you have B70s about here. So modest 30, B70 maturity would actually lower our quality grade, and it would be lowered to low choice. So the maturity and the marbling, it's called meet it or beat it. Modest 30 is lower than our B70. So our modest is going to be decreased from average choice and be deducted down to low choice. So there are some sneaky rules on our B maturity carcasses. So in the B maturity grade, we can see there's no such thing as select. It goes from choice to standard in a quick hurry. So if a carcass has slight amount of marbling or even low choice amount of marbling, and you suspect that it is B maturity, your safest bet is to call it high standard. So if you had small 50 and your B maturity would be B60, so you go your small 50, your B60, you see that it's completely skips that select grade and it goes all the way to high standard. So same thing, doesn't matter if it's high select or low select within our select grade. If it is B maturity, then it's automatically going to go to high standard. So this chart also works if we do have carcasses that are advanced in their maturity, if they're C maturity or older. So for example, if we had moderate 30 in our marbling score, but we saw that this carcass, so I said moderate 30, right? Moderate 30, but we have C90 is our maturity grade. So moderate 30, go all the way over the chart, go to C90, we can see that it is actually going to be considered average commercial. So we are going to be in the commercial utility cutter and canner grade with following this chart. For 0 to 100, 0 to 100, follow the chart across. And there are some ways that you can memorize these quality grades according to their marbling score. So ultimately, once you combine your marbling score with your maturity score, you end up with your overall quality grade. And that quality grade is going to be one of these 8 quality grades.